Greetings, everyone. My name is Evan Alexander. I'm the youth pastor here at Thomas Creek Baptist Church, and we're going to be continuing in our study through the book of Nehemiah today. We're going to be looking at Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 9 through 20. And as I've mentioned the last 2 weeks, Nehemiah is an Old Testament historical book, meaning that it's kind of hard just to jump into the middle of things because you're in the middle of a story. It's a narrative. It's a historical moment in history that we're looking at, and so there are things that have happened leading up to this point and things that will happen afterwards that bear importance on the passage we're looking at now. And so just a brief recap of what we've been looking at so far. In Nehemiah's story, we've essentially seen and understood that God's people in recent history, they've not been living for God as they should. So God enacted his judgment by sending foreign nations, foreign armies to overtake his people, overtake his land, and to exile or kick his people out of the promised land, out of Jerusalem specifically, as we're looking at here. So God's people are displaced, they are scattered, and they've been living under foreign rule for some time, but now they're able to start going back to Jerusalem. Thanks to Cyrus of Persia, I believe, made an edict that allowed Jews to begin the rebuilding process in Jerusalem. Well, they go back to Jerusalem and they hit some opposition. Things seem to be going well, and they hit some opposition. The walls are burnt down again. The foundation they began to rebuild, it's destroyed. So news of this occurrence comes to Nehemiah, a God-fearing man who's living in under the rule of King Xerxes. And so Nehemiah is distressed by this. He prays and fasts, and he feels led by God to lead the rebuilding efforts in Jerusalem. So he goes before his king, King Xerxes, and he asks for permission to go, asks for some help to go, and God's good hand was on him, as we saw last week. And God had favor in that, and Nehemiah has left. He has gone to Jerusalem to start his work that God has called him to do. And so in all of this, Nehemiah, in this passage here, he's found himself back in Jerusalem. He knows there's a huge task ahead of him, and God has called him to do something huge, something that not everyone's going to be on board with, and some are going to be opposed against. And so we'll see how that plays out in the coming chapters, but specifically today, let's look at Nehemiah's initial hurdles to following God. Last week, we looked at his first steps in following God. Well, here's his first hurdles, the first kind of things he has to kind of get through in order to be successful and to do as God has called him to accomplish here. So Nehemiah chapter 2, we're going to look at verse 9 going through the verse 20. I went to the governors of the region west of the Euphrates and gave them the king's letters, the letters that King Xerxes had given him that said, hey, he's got my permission to be there. He has, and even we'll see here, he's got my blessing on being there. If you mess with him, you're messing with me. There's kind of a little bit of protection here. So Nehemiah, he gives the leaders here the king's letters. The king had also sent officers and infantry and cavalry with me. So he sent kind of a protective detail with Nehemiah. And here's where we start seeing some of the opposition start to play. Verse 10, when Sanballat, the Oronite, and Tobiah the Amorite when those officials heard that someone was coming to pursue the prosperity of the Israelites, they were greatly displeased. We'll come back to them, but the story shifts in verse 11 back to Nehemiah. After I arrived in Jerusalem, and I had been there for 3 days, I got up at night and took a few men with me. I didn't tell anyone what my God had laid on my heart to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I took was the one I was riding, and I went out at night through the valley gate, through the serpent's wall, and the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that had been broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. I went on to the fountain gate, and to the king's pool, but farther down it became too narrow for my animal to go through, so I went up at night, by way of the valley and inspected the wall. Then heading back, I entered through the valley gate and returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, for I had not yet told the Jews, priests, nobles, officials, or the rest of those who would be doing the work. I love that comment. We'll get to it later. I hadn't told those who would be doing the work what I was doing yet. Verse 17, so I said to them, now he's going to address and tell them what's happening. Verse 17, so I said to them, all those that is listed, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned down. Come, let's rebuild Jerusalem's wall so that we will no longer be a disgrace. I told them how the gracious hand of my God had been on me and what the king had said to me. And they said, their reply to that was, let's start rebuilding. And their hands were strengthened to do the good work. So they'd say, yes, we're going to start this. God strengthens them and gives them kind of a desire to accomplish this task. And more of the opposition hits. Verse 19 again, I said, we come back. This is where we come. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Amorite official, and Geshem the Arab, someone else has joined their little gang here, the Arab, heard about this. They mocked and despised us and said, "What is this you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" I gave them this reply: the God of the heavens is the one who will grant us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, and you have no share, right, or historic claim in Jerusalem. We're going to end here because the story goes on and on and on for some time. But in all of this, just kind of ending in chapter 2 here, what are some of the initial hurdles that Nehemiah is facing when it comes to following God? God's plan for his life, God's mission during this season of Jewish history. What is God trying to accomplish, and what's kind of standing in the way for Nehemiah accomplishing what God has called him to do? Well, the first hurdle he has is just knowing what to do. Knowing the work to be done. Look at what Nehemiah is doing here. He sneaks out at night to kind of get an idea of what needs to be done. He's heard of the damage. He's heard of the gates that are destroyed by fire. He's heard of these different things, but it's been some time since he's seen it for himself. There's been so much damage. It's kind of hard to get a realistic view of what needs to be done when you just heard from other people instead of seeing it yourself. So in all of this, we see Nehemiah checking things out. But why is he doing it at night? Why is he kind of sneaking around? We see this from verse 10. See some of this from verse 10. That some of the local leaders were displeased with his arrival. He'd come in with the king's military escort for the purpose of seeing the Jews successful at rebuilding. This opposition we'll discuss a little more later, but it's going to get worse in the chapters that progress. So in this, Nehemiah is having to kind of be a little bit secretive in how he's going about this. One, he doesn't want to start a war before it's even begun. And secondly, as we'll also discuss here in a minute, he doesn't want to scare off the Jews before they even get started. So he's having to know the work that needs to be done. That's hurdle number one. Like we talked about in last week's video, Nehemiah isn't just jumping into things haphazardly. In fact, he's doing some of this reconnaissance just so that he can plan better, so that he can be better prepared for the work that is to be done. So in the dark of night, what does he do? He slips his protective detail, and takes just a few men with him, and gets a lay of the land. It's a pretty bold and cool move on his part. But Nehemiah, he's heard of this. He wants to see it for himself. Sometimes before we do something big for God, there's a need for us to know what we're getting ourselves into. Jesus himself even makes this abundantly clear when he talks to those who are listening to him and those that are following him. Jesus tells them that it's important for them to count the cost before following him. You have to count the cost to know what you're getting yourself into when you become a believer or follower of Jesus Christ. So before you take these huge steps, know what you're getting yourself into. Nehemiah is figuring out what he's figuring out what he needs to be doing here. He's kind of getting himself acclimated to this counting the cost, as Jesus would later tell his disciples to count the cost and figure out what they need to give up to follow him. And Nehemiah needs to know what work needs to be done, where things are the worst, who he's going to put on what detail, and so he can better plan for the work ahead. As Christians, we have to know what we're getting into when we decide to follow Jesus. If that's a decision that we make, Jesus warns us to count the cost. Know that being a Christian will be difficult, not easy. Following Christ will lead to complicated times, not easy times. And so we have to have a real picture of what we're signing up for. Nehemiah, he scouts out the damage and work ahead so that he can better prepare for what is to come. The first hurdle is knowing what work needs to be done. In our own lives, if we're going to make this applicable to us, what needs to be done in our lives? Are we looking ahead in our life to see what God has planned for us? As Nehemiah examines the broken walls, are we examining our weak points? Our weak points are broken walls when it comes to fighting against temptation and sin. Are there areas of our life that make us susceptible to following perhaps Satan or the world as opposed to God? Are there weak points in our walls, in our defenses spiritually? So in all of this, Nehemiah, he has to know the work that needs to be done. He's got to know what work needs to be done. And for us, we got to know where we're prone to slip up, where we need to begin putting our efforts into following Jesus more faithfully in our lives. When it comes to following Jesus, we've got to be real with ourselves in knowing what God has called us to do and who he has called us to be. And until we have a clear picture of who we are to be, it's really difficult for us to make a plan and journey on and growing in Christ. So we got to have a real picture of the work that needs to be done. What have I got to do? What do we have to do in our lives to be who God is calling us to be? What's it going to cost us? Nehemiah jumps that hurdle. He scouts things out. And we see kind of the next hurdle he comes to. And that's motivating God's people to action. This is the second hurdle that Nehemiah is going to face, motivating God's people to action. Like I said, Nehemiah kind of had two purposes in doing his secret spy mission at night. First, like I mentioned, he doesn't want to start a war before it starts with the opposition. We'll discuss that in a little bit. But secondly, he doesn't want to scare off God's people before they even get started. Now remember, they'd already tried to begin rebuilding the walls, and they had not seen success. They had faced some pretty quick opposition, and as we've seen in previous passages, they're ashamed. They've brought disgrace upon the name of God because they've been, unsuccessful in this endeavor. And essentially, if someone comes in and starts barking orders around, they might get spooked or start to buck back and fight against the plan here. Look at verse 16. It says, "The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, for I had not yet told the Jews, priests, nobles, officials, or the rest of those that would be doing the work." It's kind of like Nehemiah already has in his mind, I can't do this alone, and these guys are going to do it. They just don't know it yet. It makes me think sometimes of just being married now. There's things that Kristen has for me to do that I'm not aware of yet. As a child or as a student, there's probably things that your parents already know you're going to do, but you're not exactly signed on for it yet. And all of this, I love how this is worded because Nehemiah knows he can't do this on his own, and he already has it in his mind and already knows that God's people will assist him in this. He does not expect to accomplish this great task alone. He knows that he needs the people of God to accomplish the will of God. He needs the people of God in order to accomplish the will of God. Sometimes some of the greatest opposition we'll face, and this is why we're going to hit this before the outward opposition, sometimes the greatest opposition we face as followers of Christ is not from atheists or other religious groups that are antagonistic against Christianity. Sometimes the greatest opposition we face when it comes to following God's plan is from the church itself. Sometimes the greatest opposition we face is from the church itself, from those who claim to follow Jesus, yet they constantly work against God's plan rather than for it. And you'll see this, you'll understand this as you talk to and examine the world around us and see how they view the church. You'll often have three different perceptions that are very prevalent when you talk to people outside of the church. Some will view the church as irrelevant, some will view it as a joke, and many will view it as just being full of hateful people. These are all supposed to be incorrect perceptions of the church, but oftentimes they have some valid points that they make. In this, we see that people think that the church is irrelevant because they think that the views of the church are outdated. And honestly, it doesn't look like it's even important for them. They see Christians that claim to believe in an all-powerful God, but it doesn't really seem to impact their lives very much. If I'm looking at the church as an outsider and I see that people claim to believe in this spiritual deity, this all-powerful God that created everything and has a plan for my lives, but then I start looking at their lives, if things don't add up, I'm going to see the church as irrelevant. I'm going to see the church as irrelevant, not important. In all of this, we know, we've seen, we've experienced, and some of us have been Christians whose lives seem to be not impacted whatsoever by what God has done. That's a problem. That's an issue. And that can lead to so much opposition that is unnecessary just because there are people who claim to be Christians that haven't been impacted in that way. So they'll see the church as irrelevant. They'll see the church as a joke. They'll see the church as a joke. They'll see false teachers and so-called Christians that will lead some to think that Christianity is just a time of make-believe for weak-minded people being taken advantage of by what seems to be like a cult. You just turn on the TV sometimes and listen to some of the false teachers we have, and no wonder the world around us laughs at Christians. Those who claim to be people of faith, but they live so contrary to God's word. In fact, actually, statistically, it's not always fun to get into statistics, but there's been some statistics that have made it very clear that it's actually more likely for someone that didn't grow up in the church, that lived their life outside of the church, for them to become a Christian later in life, than for someone who grew up in the church and it was just casual or not really important to them. The reason why is because someone who grows up in the church, just coming, every other Sunday, coming on Christmas and Easter, really not getting involved, not being a part of things, they just end up becoming so calloused against Christianity because they've never actually seen what genuine Christianity looks like. So people outside the church, they'll see Christians, they'll see the church, they'll see God as irrelevant, as a joke. They'll even see it as a place filled with hateful people that think they're just better than other people. And if we're honest, why do people think that about the church? Because so often, sadly, it's true. So often, sadly, the greatest opposition we face as Christians is from inside. It's from people that claim to have the same faith we do, they claim to believe in God, but they live their lives so contrary to the ways that God has called us to live. So Nehemiah, he's got a task for him. He's dealing with motivating God's people to action. This is a great hurdle for him to actually get Christians or people of faith during that time to do what they need to do. That's a hurdle if I've ever known one. Not only do we have wolves in sheep's clothing, as we just talked about, people who claim to be of faith but don't actually have faith, but we also have the sad reality that they've just tried to do this and failed. They've just experienced a great setback. They've experienced defeat, and many well-intentioned people of faith are tempted to just give up when they face opposition. And that's why he keeps silent for the first part of the story. That's why he keeps silent, not only because he doesn't want to start a war with the people outside the faith, but he also doesn't want to scare off those who are inside the faith. He doesn't want them to run off and give up before they've even begun. So now he addresses them, though. Now he starts to jump this hurdle. Verse 17, he starts to address them. I said to them, "You see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned. Come, let's rebuild Jerusalem's walls so that we will no longer be a disgrace." That clarifying there is so important. Verse 18, I told them how the gracious hand of my God has been on me. We saw that from verse 8 last week. I told them of how the gracious hand of my God has been on me and that what the king had said to me. His opening point, God's name's at stake. His opening point is that people outside of the Jewish faith are looking at us and they're laughing at us. They're laughing at us, they're laughing at our God because it seems as though God has abandoned us. It seems as though God isn't present. It seems as though God's not even here. The trouble we're in, the state of Jerusalem, what's that say about our God? It says he's pretty weak. And you know what? That makes things pretty disgraceful for us. As we've talked about, the church today, in many ways, Christians can be a bit of a disgrace to God. Let's be real for a moment. Even our lives can make a mockery of God. God's name isn't at stake in walls or cities or even nations anymore. It's in the lives of his people where the Spirit of God dwells. And so I would believe if Nehemiah is present here today, he'd take a couple quick glances at the church and he'd say about the same. He'd say about the same to us. He'd point to Christians who have failed to live for God's name, and he'd say, just as he's saying here, let's not be a disgrace to God anymore. Let's live differently. Let's live differently. Let's start to live our lives differently. Let's start living as though God is in power. Let's start living as though God is in control. Let's start living as though we trust in him. Let's not be a disgrace anymore. So I would say that'd be a pretty clear command for us, but that's also not a good place just to end by saying you're all a disgrace, we're all a disgrace. He gives a bit more motivation here. So he not only argues here that we're not to be a disgrace to God, but he reminds them God's still working. God hasn't quit. God hasn't given up. Though we may have slipped up, though we may experience setbacks, let's be reminded today that God is not done. God's not done yet. And if God may seem to be absent, but he's not absent. Look at what he's been doing. Look at how he's been at work. Look at what God has done. Is he not still capable to be with us today, even in the midst of this? Nehemiah's second hurdle here in motivating God's people, it allows us to rightfully see that we need to be called out sometimes. The people of God need to be called out sometimes, but we also need to be reminded of what God is doing, of what God has done. And they reply, as I hope we would today, being faced with the same realities. They say, let's start rebuilding. And it says their hands were strengthened to do the good work. Their hands were strengthened to do the good work. Now, their good work may have been rebuilding a wall. Our good work is so much gooder, if that's going to be allowed for me to say. It is so much more good, because though they've been called to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem, to start rebuilding God's holy city, we've been called to reach the nations with the gospel. We've been given the good news of Jesus Christ. That is a hope in the midst of brokenness, a light in the midst of the dark. And if we look at the world around us, we see a lot of darkness. But God is still God. God is still at work. God has not given up. So let us, as people of faith, pick up our tools and say, let's start rebuilding. Let's get to work. God strengthens us to do this good work. That is hurdle number 2 that Nehemiah jumps over. And finally, we're going to look at hurdle number 3, and we're going to discuss this more in days ahead because it's going to become so much more prominent as we continue forward. But as we seek to follow God in this way, is everyone going to be happy with our lives and our work? No. No. We face opposition, yes, from inside the church, but there's a lot of opposition outside the church as well. There's a lot of opposition outside the church as well. And so hurdle number 3 for Nehemiah, and even us, I've just labeled as opposition from haters. Opposition from haters. Look at verse number 10. This is where we come back to the opposition. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Amorite official heard that someone had come to pursue the prosperity of the Israelites, they were greatly displeased. Like I said, that's one of the reasons Nehemiah kind of set out on his reconnaissance mission in secret, because he didn't want to face his opposition early, but the opposition still comes. Looking at verse 19, after he faces the Israelites and gives them their charge, it says again, the same people, and Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Amorite official, and someone else joins in, Geshem the Arab, heard about this. They mocked and despised us and said, "What is this you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" We even see Nehemiah's reply, and I'll go ahead and say this. And it says, I gave them this reply: the God of the heavens is the one who will grant us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, but you have no share, no right, no historic claim in Jerusalem. So what opposition did Nehemiah initially hit here? And he'll hit more in the days to come, but what does he initially hit here? Well, they mocked him. They made fun. They mocked Nehemiah. They despised him. They hated him. They even asked, "Are you rebelling against the king?" They seem to imply that living for God faithfully is going to go against earthly rule, and, they're not wrong. They're not wrong. Oh, they shouldn't be wrong, at least. No, I don't want to venture into politics, especially nowadays, but looking at just American history in years gone by, we've kind of been lucky as Christians to live in a place that for so many years, at least in some ways and on the surface, has valued Christianity. Many ideals, many ways of life, many ways of thought have been shaped by Christian values, and that's been wonderful. That's been great, but it's also quickly changing, very quickly changing. It also, I would argue, has led to many having a nominal sense of Christianity that equates being a Christian with being American, and that's just not the case. That's a message for another day, though. But here we see this conflict that they kind of see here. That, are you going to start living against the king? Are you going to start living in a way that is contrary to our worldly rule, that is antagonistic against us? You already see that the world around us kind of shifting and changing, and it's been happening for a long time, but it's getting worse in the days ahead, to where you'll see in conversations you have with peers, just living faithfully for God is going to be interpreted as all-out warfare by those who oppose Christianity. Living faithfully for God is going to be viewed, labeled, interpreted as all-out warfare. Whether the conversation be race, whether it be pro-life, pro-choice, whether it be whatever it may be, it's going to be seen as contrary, different, restricting rights. It's going to be everything's going to be about taking away and living in contrast. And so all of that to say, they're not exactly wrong in asking this question: are you going to be living against the king? And Nehemiah rightly puts them in their place, but we'll get to that. Because though it can seem so dark and dreary and so much contrast and conflict ahead for us, there's an old hymn that called "This Is My Father's World" that I think is so relevant here. Because there's a verse in it that says this: "This is my Father's world, oh let me never forget, that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. This is my Father's world, the battle is not done. Jesus who died shall be satisfied, and earth and heaven be one." For now, we see Nehemiah jumping this hurdle, but we don't yet know whether he'll land it or not. For the moment, though, I want us to grasp Nehemiah's response here and really understand this: that Nehemiah is confident in this truth: God will bring the victory. God will bring the victory. He will grant us success. And he gives it another old claim here, saying that, "and we'll remain faithful." God will bring the victory, and we will remain faithful. That's his charge today. In the midst of all these hurdles, Nehemiah is confident God will bring victory. We will remain faithful. Do we believe that? Do we genuinely believe that no matter what we face, God is still in control? That God is going to be bringing the victory no matter what? Though we may face opposition, though we may have failed, do we believe that God will still bring home the win? If we believe that, we cannot quit. We cannot give up. Instead, we need to do as Nehemiah does here by claiming and promising, committing, being confident that we will remain faithful. I hope you will be. God bless you. Hope you have a great week. We'll continue Nehemiah next week.